again.
I always enjoy the minute and a half of you.
But it's like
getting
silent,
prepped, yeah.
silent. Well, because the
And
problem
I
is
always try to scrub past it, and then I go too far. I gotta go back.
past it. Scrub past it. I know. I feel bad, but I'm like, I can't. Part of it is I have to start it, and then I have to mute it. It's the whole thing. So, yeah, like I have to make sure that the stream is muted because otherwise it
Right, you get
creates
the double.
So let's make sure it's set. All right, we're live. We're setting this up. Clearly, this is a high-tech operation, so we'll just let that exist. There's probably there's a way to stop. I should probably just do that from now on. That's on me. We're learning on the fly. All right. So here we go. Week 10. We probably don't need to look at ourselves. We can, if Paul joins the chat, we want to be able to interact with Paul.
Yeah.
Call-in show? Maybe La Magna. If you want to call in, you can. The phone is here. So anyway, sir, you don't need an introduction. We have Steve Kornacki here taking a break from the touchscreen. How are you?
And from khakis, I got my Fetterman hoodie on today in celebration of a great race.
Poor Dr. Oz.
Yeah, may he go back to New Jersey where he belongs. But no, I'm good. Had a busy day working the polls here in Florida yesterday. Exhausted. Answered a lot of questions. Did a lot of have a nice day. Helped a lot of old people with technology.
There's a lot of that around here.
Yeah. In my own home too, while I'm here. It's a
Hey,
little thing I get
important.
to do.
I gotta say, when I voted early over the weekend, and it was, it's all electronic. You use this touch screen, and then it prints it back out on your ballot that was blank, and then you go submit. I was like, whoa, Florida, whoa. I know we don't need hanging chads anymore, but
Yeah,
I was impressed. It was a nice, easy setup. Made it very easy to vote. Other than those terribly worded constitutional amendments.
All the double negatives.
I love Florida. I go, do I want to pay taxes for first responders? What? Yeah, it's always good stuff. So let's start with the politics talk, right? I think that's what this pod probably is really for, right?
Yeah,
right.
That's who tunes in.
That's right. That's right. So, all right, give us your thoughts. Basically, 24 hours later, more or less, on what happened nationwide. Any particular races you want to?
I would say this was, to me, definitely this was not a night from which you can draw major conclusions. This was a state by state, race by race election.
Yep.
You know, let's take the Democrat side of things. It was not a great night for the party because you still look at 60% of people in exit polls don't want Biden to run again. And that's across the board of political affiliation. So it's not a referendum that the GOP is awful and we love Democrats. But Democrats did do super well, especially in districts where they could run on infrastructure. These moderate Democrats like Spanberger in Virginia, Slotkin and Haley Stevens up in Michigan, who really ran on that, and abortion is a piece of it, had a great night. Obviously, Florida is behind this kind of moat where we had this 16% rightward shift for the party, which, you know, I'm sure we'll talk about what that could mean for DeSantis in 24.
Well, we can talk about what the reasons for that are too. But yeah, definitely. I think you're right. Individual races for the Democrats, it's a win in the sense of you avoided the red wave, you avoided the midterm massacre that generally presidents have to go through. So this administration gets to breathe a little bit easier today, but it's not a win in the sense of really this is, I think, and we touch on it individually, a lot of these races, it's still Trump fatigue or MAGA fatigue or individual candidates being terrible. And we'll see what that means in Georgia.
I think the story of the night to me really comes down to, it's very likely that a judge in New York decided who has control of the House. Given how close this is going to be, when they did not go back and redo those maps again, it mostly looks like that judge and the coattails that Lee Zeldin had probably flipped or kept about 5 districts in the hands of Republicans, and that might be all the difference in the world.
Oh, easily.
I think that's going to be really interesting to see how most of those shake out, and most of those 5 are already being called for.
Yeah, I think the hardest thing is it looks like it's gonna, if the Republicans do take the House, it's by maybe 2 or 3 seats. So it's a razor thin margin. There's gonna be an intra-party struggle for the majority position. We know Scalise is already gonna run. McCarthy's certainly gonna want that position back. There could be some moderates who come forward. The Democrats are certainly going to try to court moderate Republicans. So that's going to be interesting on the national level. But you're right, individual races, they still have, it's going to be a long way until Nevada's called, Arizona as well, possibly. But yeah, it looks to be interesting. And Georgia's going to be a runoff, so that matters a lot.
And not a 40 that he thinks it's going to be. It's an actual
election.
Well, again.
I don't think Herschel Walker knows what anything means nowadays. I think you could tell him anything, and if the right person said it to him, he'd believe it, and that's it, lock, stock, barrel. I think huge, right. We've seen people like Lorraine Boebert. It looks like she's going to lose. That's very, very tight, but she is trailing. That's a huge loss. You've seen Democratic governors elected in states like Kansas. It's state level. Some of this maybe has to do with the abortion and the Supreme Court ruling. Certainly,
and Kelly also had incumbency in Kansas.
Right. But there's. You normally look at states and you go, well, look at what happened in 2020. Now we're in a midterm. You would expect there to be carryover. But yeah,
something I look at, I think what's really interesting, there are two races that I think were really interesting. One is in New Hampshire, Maggie Hassan holding on to that seat.
Yes.
In previously she won by less than 1%, and now she won by 10% pretty much this time right now. Granted, there's a candidate quality question there, but still that kind of improvement's really impressive. And in Wisconsin, I also had Tony Evers, who I think won by about 1.5 points, now wins by about 4 or 5 in a state that is most definitely going to be competitive.
Of course. Yeah. I mean, I think as we look ahead, you shift and you look ahead to 2024, that's I think the biggest takeaway. You have, let's take Florida, for example. You touched on it. Florida, everybody thought with COVID, you had all these people coming from the Northeast moving to Florida. What they found is that Republican registrations far outpaced Democratic registrations in the state, meaning all of the influx of population actually worked for the Republicans' favor. Now, part of the Democratic problem is for the governor. Chris won the primary. That's a retread. He doesn't inspire a lot of
terrible,
enthusiasm, right? He's not a great campaigner in that sense. And DeSantis goes from what was a super tight election against, Gillum, with all the skeletons in his closet 4 years ago, to a runaway 20-point landslide, and now being able to essentially go nationally and say, "Look, I can deliver Florida on a presidential level." That's huge. And Rubio didn't quite have the same margin victory over Val Demings, but a significant improvement for him compared to where he was 6 years ago in terms of the numbers. So, and the Democrats spent $75 million on Val Demings' campaign. That is a massive loss in just the state of Florida, but it speaks also of how important it is to pick the right candidates and the right.
Think about if that money had been in North Carolina, Sherry Beasley lost about 3 points.
Right.
That was probably a winnable race if they had more money.
That's how it goes. I mean, you have to make these decisions months in advance. Yeah, certainly. I think what's more interesting, or not more interesting, but compelling, right? I think it was, is it Kentucky or Tennessee? I mean, it's Tennessee. What? Swaddle him. Okay. All right. Baby alert. In Tennessee, slavery was banned as punishment, only received 80% of the vote. So 20% of people in a state in this beautiful country,
Lord, 2022,
believe slavery should be a punishment. I don't want to know what the context of this vote was. That happened. So, we see you in the chat, Paul. We know you're here. We wanted to make sure that we acknowledged you. So yeah, it's certainly going to be interesting. I don't know if you saw this. So President Trump, as like a Newsmax interview or something, said, if we do great, I get all the credit, and if we lose, I get none of the blame. So honestly, that's kind of how I approach fantasy football, right? I want all the credit, none of the blame. I also appreciated Trump saying that when asked if DeSantis is going to run, what will he do? Saying, well, I've got more dirt on him than anyone else other than DeSantis's wife. So be curious to see that.
Well, the
that
battle
showdown.
between them is now out in the open, right? He comes out on Saturday night, Ron DeSanctimonious. He's got a name for him ready to go. I think what'll be really interesting to see is you look at the candidates that he endorsed. You know, we're still waiting to see on Kari Lake. We're still obviously waiting to hear about the Nevada Senate race. We're still waiting to see on Walker for sure.
Mhm.
But for the most part, everybody, especially in the big marquee races that are
Right.
not these R
Oz.
plus 24 districts.
He was with Oz, what,
losing.
Monday night?
Yeah, obviously Vance won, but for the most part, these candidates all go down.
Yeah. Other than Vance and Johnson, I think Trump really served as an anchor and is a dead weight.
Absolutely. And so now,
yeah.
you know, you fear the thing that you think can have impact. If what we're seeing is that he doesn't have a positive impact for you anymore, will we start to see some more people come out of the woodwork and start to be more independently minded, at least as it relates to Trump?
Yeah, and I would expect that to happen, right? Now the Democrats in the House have a problem because you have the January 6th committee, which come January, that's not going to exist anymore.
Mm-hmm.
So you have a very finite amount of time here to wrap up and publish whatever you want published. Liz Cheney, that goes for her too.
Mm-hmm.
On the flip side of that, the Republicans are going to have an infight for majority leader, most likely. And then spinning that forward, I agree with you. I think who in the Republican Party tries to differentiate from Trump, and what are the ways? What are the attacks? Is it policy? Is it style? Is it personality? What are the differences? Trump obviously feels like he deserves the second term, but at the end of the day, yeah, he's probably the reason why Oz really struggled there at the end, although he had made up a lot of ground, and some of these other high-profile candidates had struggled. Walker, Paul wants to know, does Walker have real traction? He probably has positive traction in his vehicles that he was driving women to abortion clinics, but I don't know about any other type of traction, certainly not any traction of the mind.
Well, and I said this to you before, I think
course.
what's really interesting is if Masto holds on to win in Nevada, it's 50-49 going in. So technically balance of power in the Senate does not hang on this race. Do the people that held their nose and voted for Walker because they thought it did, will they now not show up and Warnock can win with a little bit more of a comfortable margin?
Right. And we've seen Georgia, right? Georgia Senate races love to go to runoffs, as we know.
The man's had 4 elections in 2 years.
Yeah. I mean, usually he's basically a House candidate. All he does is campaign and fundraise, right? That's the joke. The House candidate has to start fundraising this as soon as they win re-election. It's Georgia's going to be interesting. If you're right, if the Democrats already have 50, I think we do not see good turnout, probably on either side, and Warnock wins. If it is for the control of the Senate, probably a lot of people will hold their nose, and you see those 2% that voted libertarian. Maybe that's the difference. Right. I would expect turnout to be low or lower anyway for that race. Number one, it's a runoff. 2, people are going to be so tired in Georgia of these races. So, it's going to be very telling to see what happens there in a month. And yes, Paul, definitely vote before the Steelers game when they were on bye did not help Mehmet Oz. I don't think anything helped Mehmet Oz in that race, other than unless Fetterman had, completely been unable to make words in an interview. I think other than that whole debacle, I don't think there's any other way he was going to lose. He's so well liked in that state. He had such an advantage, but
ran a great campaign too. Quite frankly,
they did a good job,
and so did Shapiro. I think you look at who might have who's a future national candidate for both parties out of this. I think Shapiro made a great case for himself with that race. He ran a really disciplined campaign. I think Whitmer in Michigan, the way that she's
handled herself really well the last few years.
Handled herself well, and really, quite frankly, cruised to re-election. He won by about 7 or 8 points over Dick Dunn, another Trump candidate. And I think on the Republican side, obviously Trump, DeSantis are the 2 big ones taking up all the air in the room. I think if Lake can come back and win in Arizona, super interesting VP pick because Trump is going to pick for a demographic category. I also think.
Well, I think both parties do, right? I mean, that's why Biden went to Albuquerque to campaign for Michelle Lujan Grisham when New Mexico, which when I lived there was very much a purple toss-up 50-50 state, now skews solidly blue. All of the seats are blue. House, Senate, doesn't matter. And so I think him going to campaign in the Southwest with a female Hispanic is telling, if you're Kamala Harris, I better do something here to prove my worth, because he will replace you if he runs with someone who courts the Hispanic community, because that's where the Democrats are really losing ground nationwide. Is not, maybe not in certain states, but nationwide, Hispanics are starting to trend a little bit more toward the Republicans enough.
When we see that's half the case in Florida.
Well, Florida, it's unique because you have such a different, you have Cuban
heavy Cuban
population versus
right.
the Mexican population, and there are differences there, what matters. But yes, nationwide, that is a problem for the Democrats. Much as is the fact that they really only dominate in the youth category. That's a separate problem, right? You have to address that nationally, at least in a presidential race. So it'd be interesting how this goes. But I agree. I think Republicans, DeSantis is he's young. So even if he doesn't get the nomination, he's still governor for 6 more years, which means he'll be still governor 2028 to run. So I don't think DeSantis, well, he'll still be governor 2026. He could very easily still be in the national picture 2028. So I don't think DeSantis goes anywhere no matter what happens. But I'd be curious to see. Just reality, right? These guys are kind of like cockroaches. I mean, Trump and Biden are like pushing 80, and they're still Hillary. I mean, Bill Clinton's out there stumping, right? It doesn't matter how old some of these guys are. So Matt wants to know how we need to get to how his team is going to win the league. So I guess we should talk to the league. We can talk about the NFL too, for sure. There's a lot of nice topics there, but let's talk about the league. What I want to know is, here we are, 9 weeks in. We are significantly past the halfway point of the regular season. You, sir, sit in the 6th seed spot. I know you don't want to be there.
Yeah.
We can talk about that trade that has really not worked out all that well for me. Great for you, although the more games you win probably doesn't help you in the long run. But how do you feel? Are you concerned at all that you're now in the 6th seed, given the points average and what that means kind of if you end up in a tie?
So, I mean, I'll say I hate my team. I have hated my team since I did the first mock draft and knew that I was going to probably have to take DeAndre Swift in that slot. Did not like anything that was setting me up for. I would say, am I afraid of, listen, here's the way I look at fantasy football. I want to be one of two things. I want to be god awful so that I have the first pick next year, or I want to be in the mix for the playoffs. I never want to be mediocre and be stuck in the middle. In my opinion, it's just
right. And that's true of the real NFL.
I'm not trying to keep my job. I have my job no matter what here. Well, for the most part, we'll talk about that in a bit.
I don't know. Fake Adam Schefter on Twitter fired Josh McDaniels today, so anything's possible.
Someone else will buy a blue check and take over the team for me. But my issue with this team, I just do not like what I have. I think there was a piece of me that was saying, okay, if Elijah Mitchell comes back from injury, let's go back, right? Week 1, you beat me by 1.5 points. Elijah Mitchell doesn't get injured in that game, I probably beat you.
Right, probably.
Because there was a ton of game left. I think he went down in the second quarter.
Yeah, right.
That happens. All right, in the back of my head, okay, if I'm in the mix, he comes back from injury, he's the lead in the backfield. Well, all of a sudden, Christian McCaffrey shows up. Who knows what the heck is going to happen with the Pittsburgh backfield? Tomlin is seemingly warming up on Jaylen Warren here. I can't start both those guys in a week. That running game is not good enough. So now I've got Dameon Pierce and this mix of a Steelers or a Harris, or who else do I think
who's either injured or has an illness.
It's just all a mess. Like, could I try to pull off a few moves with the draft capital that I have now taken from you? Maybe. Do I want to?
Well, here's the reality, right? And I think this is something Lamagna and I talked about this a number of times, because he's very much concerned about how can he find, not so much can he, but wanting me to trip up enough, although it's going to take a lot to, at least trip up enough to fall out of the 1, because I think right now him and I are on this collision course in the semifinals that I think neither one of us wants to have.
Oh, absolutely.
Reality is Matt's not losing enough games to fall to the 6. He'd only be able to avoid me if I fall to the 2. I have to finish with 1 loss more than, I'd have to finish at least tied with Joe. And right now I'm ahead on points 4. So I probably need to have 2 losses in the final 5 weeks, which, although this week doesn't look like it's going to be an easy one for me, 2 losses might be a stretch. So Lamagna's concerned about that, because he's also wants someone to upset Wagner in the first round of the playoffs for comedy purposes. But I think the problem for your team is what helps you is you still have to play 3 playoff teams.
Yep.
So you're probably going to take the L against Matt and I. The matchup with Drew is almost a must win. And you would have to win the next 2 weeks to even get to that position to say, okay, now I probably have enough cushion, right, to
Yeah.
get in.
And that's why I look at it. So I've got Manny this week, and then I think I've got Evan next week.
Okay, well, we know one of those is a sure thing.
Yeah, exactly. So that's why I look at it. I got a sure thing, and I know I've pretty much probably got 2 sure losses. So it's this question of what happens against Manny, and then what happens in that matchup with Drew. Let's say I win Drew. I actually don't know if I can beat Manny this week. Like, even just looking at the projections, I'm not in a good position, but I've won these shitty matchups.
Manny's entire team is dependent on Kamara having one of these 2 or 3 touchdown games. We watched Monday Night Football, and he barely touches the ball in a game that's competitive and they're losing, which makes no sense. And then he'll go off on the next week. So Manny has this Kamara problem. But you're right. Your team on paper is not strong, probably will fall out because the nature of the schedule is such that one of these other teams is probably going to finish like 3-2 or just enough. And then the way the points might shake out, we've seen a lot. Matt thinks it'd be remiss not to mention that, yes, him and I have to play again and I have to play Drew. But the reality is it's possible for me to lose 2 or even 3 games down the stretch and for Matt to go undefeated and for that to flop. Or
you might want to rest some of your best players.
I'm more concerned. They're all on bye right now. This week, I've got like 5 guys on bye, most of whom Mark Andrews and Jamar Chase better get healthy and come back next week. Marquise Brown better get off IR soon. So I could get healthy and become all of a sudden feel much better. That's all well and good. I'm very curious to see Tate all of a sudden makes a trade for a receiver. Were there other options available? Yes, he seems to still maybe be in the market. That's a team. Hey, he's record wise tied with you.
Right.
The points for are all very close between those 4 and 5 and 3 and 6 teams.
Oh, yeah, we're all in the same
so you're all in the same boat where 1 or 2 good weeks is going to put someone up ahead. What does that take? And so
I'll say when I saw that trade, to me, I'm looking at more that's a position for draft than anything else. Try to make a win in the consolation bracket. Eric's already said that he's in a seller position, and I don't think that there's just so much that's up in the air. And I do think what makes it hard to figure out what to do right now is that everybody is really in contention. With the exception of the 2 teams that we've discussed quite frequently as not being in that position at all. So it's hard to even go through and look at who am I trying to make a trade with here? Who wants the draft capital that I have? Because is there anybody who's really saying, well, I can look at this and I actually do have an outside shot. And so I think it's going to end up being perhaps a very, very noisy trade deadline when that comes up on, what is it, the 27th, I think? 22nd, because that, we'll have 2 more games kind of in the can at that point, and then we'll really be able to say, all right, from this batch of us that are sitting at 4 and 5 and 3 and 6, who's really decided that they're not part of the set.
Yeah, we'll touch on trade deadline in a second. I have to go and swaddle a baby real quick, so I'll turn the floor over to you. Paul, I'm not going to be able to make your 6:15 Peloton ride. I'm having a beer, and there's a baby that may or may not want to sleep. So 2 minutes.
I'll hold
2
minutes. I'll talk about the NFL while I wait for you.
You can talk about the Jets. Make this
Would love to. We're going to make this a Jets segment. This is the 2 minutes I'll talk all year about the Jets because I don't like to, that I'm going to jinx them in this process. Listen, I think the Jets are a really interesting team this year. I think they have overperformed all the expectations I've had, but the piece for this team that is the issue, as I always talk about relief pitching in the New York Mets, it's the quarterback and the New York Jets. I really do not think that they can continue to compete with him. I would rather have forget about Geno Smith with the Seahawks. I'd rather have Jets Geno Smith or Jets Mark Sanchez back with that team. And I think a huge reason for this is the difficulty we're having with the offensive line and injuries, losing Tucker out for the season. We've had Becton and Fant go down at different points. I just don't know if we can hold this together. I think there's going to be way too many takeaways that defense is going to get worn out by the end of the season. So I just can't see a scenario where this team can and will continue to make it. I do think they might be able to pick off a playoff spot, which the question then becomes, could everybody in the AFC East make the playoffs? I don't think so. I don't think the Patriots can hold it together. I think it's going to have to be, I think the Jets can probably sneak in, and I think the Dolphins and the Bills, in my opinion, are probably pretty close to a sure thing. I would happily take one good Mike White game again. But it's, the Mike White game, and that conversation reminds me of something I've been thinking about a lot the past couple of weeks, which is Justin Herbert, who happens to be, my quarterback, as many of you know, a keeper for me 2 years in a row. And we had that conversation, I want to say, was it after the Raiders game, where everyone was saying, are we overestimating Justin Herbert too soon, or do we coronate him as a top 3 quarterback too early? And it's reminding me of that Mike White scenario from last season, where it was, he had a great game and then he was all we talked about, especially because it was a New York media market, for the next 6 days. Justin Herbert has right now 2 poor-ish games back to back. But if you look at the body of work, is someone who really does continue to be on an upward trajectory with his career. And I think that speaks to, with football, we have so much time in between games that we've got to fill the narrative space that we don't have with baseball, that we don't have with basketball, that we don't have with hockey. So we're going to try to create conversation out of something, because we've got to fill up 24 hours a day on NFL Network. I don't know where I'm going with that, but that is kind of what I can offer here. I'm going to jump off, another topic that Lowell gave me here in preparation for today, which was this question of the, NFC South is absolutely god awful. Are they as bad as the 2010 NFC West? You'll remember that was the year that I think it was the Seahawks and the Rams that were tied at 7-9 to lead that division. Then you had the 49ers and the Cardinals in there, and very likely we might have a 7-10 now team, or an 8-8 team, 8-9 team make the playoffs from that division. Thinking about it, I think it's a worse story for the 2022 NFC South, because there's so much more talent across some of those teams. I would say especially the Saints and the Bucks. Obviously, I think even the Panthers, before unloading Robbie Anderson and CMC, had some nice pieces. But you go look at those 2010 teams, I just do not think there was talent within much of those organizations. The Cardinals at that time, I couldn't even name who was quarterback. I think other than Larry Fitzgerald, I couldn't think of a single person on that team. I do think that the Rams, I'm trying to remember, that was probably... was that Bradford back then would have been at quarterback, but probably Steven Jackson was still in running back position there. So I think there was more talent that could have made that work, but I think so therefore it was more of an expectations issue. But as worst performers, it's just awful to see what's happening in the NFC South this year. I covered your NFL topics. So we got a lot done.
You already covered whether the 2022 NFC South.
That's what I was on just now.
Yeah.
So you can chime in here as someone who has a vested interest in the NFC West.
Okay. Is it worse? Here's what I think. The quality of talent on 2 of the 4 teams in the NFC South this season is better than that pitiful disgrace for a season in the NFC West. However, the on-field performance has been so atrocious and so inconsistent. They're pretty comparable, and I'd be very curious at the end of the year. I expect Tampa to at least get to 500. I would
agree.
If Jameis can ever get healthy, New Orleans, and Michael Thomas can get healthy, which doesn't seem like that'll ever happen again. Maybe New Orleans is competitive. But that NFC West year, I mean, you had 2 teams at 7-9. Couple at like 6-10. I mean, It was truly disgusting. I just don't expect that to happen, because inevitably you have to play each other. And I would just expect Tampa so much more talented. But yeah, that was what thinking about this week going, you know what? We've seen this before.
Yeah.
We have one division where all 4 teams are in the playoff picture, and one division where none really should be. It's certainly interesting. Paul, no one wants Garrett Wilson, and yes, your team is mediocre, although it is surprisingly spry. And you mentioned the trade deadline. I actually think it's going to be very quiet. I don't think there's much incentive for the top 4 teams to make big moves. There's not really big moves available. There are a couple of obviously talented players and other rosters, but what would that take? If you haven't already given up a top pick, why would you if you don't need to? LeMagnet doesn't need a receiver. Joe doesn't need a receiver. If my receivers get healthy, I don't need a receiver. Ragnar doesn't need a receiver, although Devontae Adams doesn't know what, every week to week, it's like playing roulette or Russian roulette. So I don't see a big move. If Drew decides, hey, I want to upgrade receiver and quarterback, yes, that's just not what Drew does. And I don't expect, Tates is trying to make like peripheral moves. Can I get a depth piece that's not going to cost me that much? Okay. But he's trying to make marginal improvements. He's not making a big swing. He's not saying, he's not going to me and saying, you know what, Swift is struggling right now.
Right.
What would it take to get DeAndre Swift? Because I don't know what that would be, but that's not the conversation, right? He's like, I want Tyler Boyd.
Mhm.
Okay, well, Tyler Boyd is a flex option.
Right. For
When
a couple-
Chase comes back, which is supposed to happen soon,
Right.
he's probably maybe a top 30 play, right? So I just don't see big moves because I think they've already happened,
Mhm.
right? Unless like your team, you certainly have draft capital to do it, but it doesn't make sense.
Well, to me, it's everything. I would be acquiring every piece for that run. I have very few pieces that make you say this is a team that's one or two moves away.
Right.
I'm going to have to go out and acquire top tier talent to actually make it a worthwhile.
Right. You certainly have DeAndre Swift back.
I'm very happy to not have him on my team ever again.
Paul, if you would like to trade Chris Olave to someone and you have the ability to hit accept right now, go for it. Again, you and I have had this conversation repeatedly. I'm happy to do it live on the pod. Paul, while Chris Olave intrigues me, Christian Kirk on the season has performed better and is at the same keeper value. More importantly, I don't have a player on my roster that I could just drop to acquire Chris Olave. So if I acquired him, I now have to drop a quality player or a player who has the potential to be very good, but is injured, like a Keenan Allen.
Mhm.
Why would I do that? This isn't dropping Clyde Edwards-Helaire because I need like a backup tight end or something, like I'm not dropping a touchdown dependent running back. I don't have a gimme throwaway type player. Somebody wants to come and trade me for a receipt for a player and open up a roster spot. I'm all for making a deal, Paul, but I'm not doing it for the sake of doing the deal because I look ahead and I go, Kenneth Walker's a better keeper next year. I have Tua, who's a 13th round keeper next year. Deshaun Watson, who's a 16th round keeper next year. Ramondre Stevenson, like Kirk, Chase. But I mean, I don't need to make a move for Olave. The keeper value doesn't intrigue me. And am I looking to win this week or am I looking at my whole season? It's not a marginal enough or significant enough upgrade. So Paul, if you want to execute it, you want to accept a trade that someone's offered you live and I'll execute it and we'll react to it live. Great content.
I think it may have just happened. I just got an email. Hang on.
Good. Now I don't have to deal with Paul.
There we go. Okay. Well, this changes something we were just talking about. So it's
okay. So yeah. I mean, let's react to this trade, Paul. So here's the deal. Paul gives up Olave and an 8th round pick for Allen Robinson and a 4th round pick. Now, Paul, I don't know that I entirely understand the deal because I get my trepidation plays into this because you're offering me the similar deal with a better draft pick given up, and I'm not getting one back. An 8th rounder doesn't really move the needle. And again, for Tates, he's looking to make marginal upgrades. So I agree. I love how Lamagna in the chat now is telling Paul, he literally just made an offer to you. What is this deal? And more importantly, Paul, Olave will go off this week. I hope so, but
I think it's also to me, all of the talk about Olave that we've had for so many weeks in this chat, in message boards, in the trades going back and forth for a 4th round pick, which is great. But is that the capital you're trying to amass to go into coming out of a rebuilding year to make a serious run?
What's the thing is, I think Olave, looking forward, right? He's a 7th rounder next year. They're going to get that quarterback situation improved. So he's a 7th or a 6th and a 5th. I mean, there's really potential down the road where it's very good payout.
Well, but my point is, wouldn't I rather keep him then if I have him as a choice for a 7th rather than to have a
That's not a question for Paul, right?
Yeah.
What's Paul's endgame? Other than Joe Burrow, who are you keeping? Olave is a better keeper than Garrett Wilson. He's a better keeper than Drake London. It's a target monster and a bad offense that doesn't throw the ball. If they have a different quarterback or a better system, maybe Drake London's a better keeper, but that's a huge bet to make. And I think Paul's not looking at it in the long-term situation. Paul, you're welcome to comment in the chat, but Paul's looking short-term for draft assets, and I get it. But, Tates, for example, made a very similar offer to me, Paul, for Christian Kirk. Okay. Basically the same deal. He wanted to give me Allen Robinson again. I would say I don't even want him.
No.
But again, why do I trade Kirk when this week I need Kirk?
Mhm.
You know, and again, there's top 10 receiver on the year. So it's hard to say no to that. It's hard to pass it on.
I think there's
Oh, we have snacks.
there is a flip to what is a conversation we've had before, which is that, part of the problem with Paul's strategy is you're taking these guys who are good keepers and you're inflating their value because you're taking them early. So now, right. So
Well, it hampers the value.
you're making it harder to keep them
You're
because
depressing
it's
market
possible.
value,
Yeah,
right?
sorry, I
Right.
rephrased
So
that
if
incorrectly.
Olave was taken in the 10th round or the 11th round, which is probably what he would have gone versus taken in the 8th round, whoa, it's a completely different conversation because you almost are buying 2 or 3 more really cheap
Right.
years. It's like a rookie contract, unless a player is a top 5 at their position. At some point, you really start to run out of benefit when you do the cost benefit analysis in the offseason. Right.
Well, I think the flip of that, right, is then you amass, if that strategy works, you're amassing a ton of early round picks, which if it pays off, it means you win, and that's great.
And this will be a test case,
Right.
Small sample size, but a test case on that model.
But if that doesn't work, then you're hoping that going into the next year, you've found 1 or 2 good guys on the waiver wire who have keeper value, because if not, you're either choosing, okay, I'm going to keep some guys that are maybe a little bit higher than they should be, or I'm going to go into this draft and make a pure draft for another rebuild.
Yeah. I mean, Paul, I hope you waste these 3 and 4th round picks that you've acquired on keepers. To me, that is the dream scenario for the league is, again, your keeper should be either elite players,
Mhm.
top 5 or top 10 at their position, particularly if it's a scarce position like running back. Dameon Pierce is a great example. Or it's a very young player who the cost is such that he's at least an ascending player where you can feel confident
Mhm.
the benefits are going to continue to outweigh the cost for at least a few years. And so you're making that bet. And I mean,
I like the Paul's self-grade as I've done great.
yeah, I mean, look, I'm not saying it's a bad trade. If you're Paul, I get the deal, right? I think for
Right.
Paul, it's a good trade. For Eric, it's a good trade. It's a win-win. They both get like a B, right? No one's like, wow, Paul didn't get a 3.
Right.
Tate's got a pick back, so he didn't get the pick that Olave would cost. What Tate should have said is, I want a 7, so you have to pay for Olave next year.
Mhm.
That would be the Billy Bean type of response.
Right.
And maybe that wasn't, maybe Paul said no. That would personally be, I would say, okay, you want me to do this and give you a 4, then you got to give me a 7.
Right.
Because the sliding scale is such
That he's going to have to then give
well,
a 6.
the 7th round pick is so much worse than a 4th round pick in our league. You just go and you look. So,
While we're talking about Olave, just to bridge the gap with NFL stuff, we're at the midway point here. Is Olave the offensive rookie of the year?
No, because as long as Seattle's in the playoffs, Ken Walker probably is the leader.
Mhm.
Olave doesn't get in the end zone enough.
Right.
Garrett Wilson was hot to start the year. Jake Leonard was hot to start the year.
Mhm.
Olave's been consistent because the volume is there and they have no one else to throw to, but he doesn't get in the end zone. So, okay, we get a live call in.
All right,
Let's see
here
if
we
this
go.
audio works.
Hey, put me on speaker.
Thank you. We this isn't a high tech operation, but we know how to do that. So are you a long time, first time caller?
Yeah, long time listener, first time caller, waiting for the promo code to get 15% off new bed sheets or something. But I got one call and then I'll hang up and listen. Do we
Okay.
think that Paul punted on the season too early? Ken Walker, Drake London. I think Paul could easily have been the 5th seed in the playoffs if he kept his draft the way it was and didn't start making trades till next week. All right, I'll hang up and listen.
Thank you. All right. So I'm glad that Paul is in the chat saying, I don't need a 7. Exactly, Paul. That's my point. Tate should have said to you, you must give me a 7 so that you pay for Olave. That's the Billy Bean in Moneyball saying, and you're going to pay for my soft drinks for the next 2 years. Like, that's the move to say, I don't need an 8. I want a 7. That's where Tate's could go from a B to an A, because then you get the keeper at 0 cost. That's the goal on any deal. Now, Matt's point, did Paul punt too soon?
I think there's 2 parts to that question. One is you're saying, okay, you're trying to figure out could he have won and stayed competitive? And then, but I think the part two, which is really important, is that Paul had a mindset going into the season and the draft. And that was, I'm going to punt on this season. I'm going to take young talent and go for it. So I think there was no, in my opinion, there was no other choice for Paul because he was so bought into that. And rightly or wrongly, that was his strategy and he stuck to it. And I can respect the heck out of that. That you are never looking at it and saying, okay, well, should I change the math? Like, should I flip this around a little bit and go for it? So yeah, I think he did the right thing because he stuck to his guns, has done what he's done. And he's managed to have some, but you look at what some of these wins are and some of the luck is crazy.
I think this is the answer. I think, Laman, to answer your question, no, I don't think he punted too soon. And the reason is because, yes, he was 1-3 to start the year. But let's think about that. Paul has not scored higher than 5th in any given week this year. We're 9 weeks in, okay? Before he punted on his team, he'd only scored 5th twice. That was to start the year. 9th, 11th, then 9th, 6th, 7th, 11th, 11th. He's never been 12th. He's never been higher than 5. He's been perfectly mediocre.
Broken 100 once since week 2.
Exactly. Yeah. He started out hot. He had 109, got pummeled by Wagner. He's put up 120 week 2 against Tate's, narrowly lost. That was a Garrett Wilson big breakout game. Mm-hmm. But then it's been really, really bad. And when you have all these rookies, you struggle with 2 things. 1, they have to adjust. Right. And 2, their roles are not always defined in the way that a veteran's role is. And so players aren't used as much. And so for Paul, you're 1-3. You're looking up and you're going, wow, we got a couple undefeated teams, got a bunch of teams that are really good. People are starting to maybe make trades. Why am I going to be competitive? For Paul, he'd have to have kept, now if he keeps Kenneth Walker, yeah, he probably is looking at 3 wins in a row instead of, going 2-1 in the last 3, but he's been better lately. It's not as if Paul struggled. Now, part of that is probably buys. Part of that is probably Bodson's team is terrible. Now, Evans' team is terrible. So he's had some easy wins. I don't think he punted too soon because he still has to play Drew, Manny, and then his division. Paul may go 3-2 to finish the year. He could go 2-3. I think that's perfectly fine.
But, and to Tate's, who's now improved his team quite a bit.
Well, arguably quite a bit. I mean, I think Tate's has improved his team at receiver. He's probably looking for a running back upgrade because his team needs help. But yeah, I don't think Paul punted too soon because that was his strategy. His whole roster was unproven rookies or young players. The hope was that a bunch of these guys pop off and you get trade value. Paul's executed his plan. But I think best case for Paul would probably have been being the 7th or 8th team versus being the 9th or 10th team. So it's not a marginal difference and certainly not significant enough when you think about, I'm just going to compete for the 1 seed. I don't think Paul cares because he has so much draft capital. It doesn't really matter. To me, there's other teams that missed the boat, right? Kirshner should have traded Jonathan Taylor 2 or 3 weeks ago. He's missed that opportunity. Drew is not a big trader, but could he have traded Jacobs after that big game for a receiver or quarterback or multiple players? Yeah, probably. Yeah. Kind of not interested in that. Okay. So there's other teams that have missed opportunities to improve in significant ways. Paul's team was never going to do that. It was always going to be the asset acquisition things. I don't think he punted too soon to get back to it. And I'm sure Paul is happy to hear that multiple people here that he gets respect. I'm sure that was directed at you and not me. Yes, he would have gotten more for Ken Walker to LeMagnet, but the reality is if Paul's competitive, does Paul make that trade or not, right? Like we know in fantasy football, in the playoffs, nothing's a given. Now, Paul probably doesn't care to win versus like if winning the league is not as important to Paul as it might be to somebody else, and that's okay. And Paul's right. Walker could have stung, could have gotten hurt. There's always unknowns. Just to me, I think with Paul's strategy, yeah, he handled the draft in a certain manner. He's committed to his process, right? He's the Sam Hinkie of the league, right? And I think we should give him credit and commend him for that. We'll see what it looks like in 3 or 4 years. But yeah, I mean, I wouldn't, if I'm Paul, I don't trade Burrow, right? I hold on to that asset.
Yep.
I try to see, can I go and acquire someone who maybe is a good player but is injured or something who would be a keeper? Like I look to see where can I operate in the margins of the league now to set yourself up better, because keeping Drake London or Garrett Wilson at a 1 or 2 round inflated value next year is probably not that much of a benefit to going out and saying, I don't know, just
I mean, I almost think that what Paul is doing is the closest you can ever come to just bringing a new league owner in the way that team is going to look next year. because it is going to be an entirely almost fresh start for that roster. And it'd be an interesting experiment to see how that looks. And I'm excited to do this podcast in a year and see what that is.
Yeah, Paul, when no one thinks you drafted well, you executed a plan and you're executing it well. Who do you execute it in a different way? Sure, but you're executing your plan. That's fine. The fact of the matter is you went into the draft with a strategy that long-term affects the value of those keepers, particularly at the receiver position. That's really tough. I mean, in a year or two where there's a lot more of these running backs and receiver keepers back in the system, it may look better. But right now, Justin Jefferson's still a keeper, for example. Like, it's not a given that plays out. So yeah, be interesting. So yeah, we'll finish on this. Here you are, you're on live in person, which is fantastic. Always wonderful. Glad to be even closer together when you're in town. How do you see the rest of the season play out? Whether it's playoffs, consolation, you tell us.
So I of course yet again prepared my my playoff predictions, which did take me a while to kind of think about.
I hope you did some detailed schedule analysis, because
I did do playoff schedule analysis,
Okay,
a little bit going into it.
That's fine.
I do not believe I'm going to hold on to that sixth place again. I think these next 2 week match, knowing I've got 2 guaranteed losses within this division, and I think I've got 2 losses from there. I do think Manny's going to end up taking that spot. I think he beats me this week. I think he is in such an easy division. He picks up 2 guaranteed wins there. And then there's the question of what he does the week after this. That'll be up in the open. But I think Manny's going to end up taking that 6th slot there. So
really? You don't think it'll be Tate's now? All these moves, nothing.
Maybe this trade that just happened, I'll have to reassess a little bit, but I don't think so. I think just looking at the way this is shaking out, I kind of like Manny for that. Obviously, I think you're going to hold on to that number 1. You and Richmond will get the buys there. I'm giving Richmond the 2. And then I think it's Wagner in the 3, LaMagna in the 4, Drew in the 5th, and Manny in the 6th.
Okay. All right. Paul, go stretch. Make sure to stretch before and after your ride. Okay. Yeah. Very important. I hope Sam joins you today.
So going from there, I do think what's going to happen. I think Drew will beat LaMagna in the 1st round.
Ooh,
yeah.
Ooh.
And that is based on how I like the matchups in the game.
Thank you. It's not something that LaMagna I've brought up to LaMagna, but I think there is a chance of that. I do.
Yeah, solely looking at, I definitely LaMagna has the better team, but looking at who everybody on those teams is playing that week, I think Drew has a real scheduling advantage there.
Yeah.
And down below, I'm going to give it just Manny's team cannot hold up to Wagner. So Wagner's going to win that. It gives us
Wagner is like second from the bottom in optimum points this year. His start sit decisions, or if you want to call it luck, it takes one Kamara big game or one Kareem Hunt massive game.
That's true.
And a Wagner starting 2 Eagles receivers to completely change the way the playoffs look. But yes, on paper, it's not a contest.
Yeah. Which means our semifinals are you and Drew and Wagner and Richmond. And again, looking at the schedules, unfortunately, it means it is a low car. And yet again, Richmond in the final.
Maybe we can vanquish the 2014 memories.
We have the 8-year rematch, and I'm giving it to you. I really think that just your path to the championship match is pretty straightforward. And I think you've got a better team, and the matchups that week are actually pretty even.
Yeah, they're pretty even.
When I was looking at it, but I think it's you.
Yeah, week 17. There's some interesting matchups league wide, right? I think it's Buffalo and the Bengals play like that. That could be very high scoring. It kind of would need it to be most likely. You're right. Joe would be an interesting one. I'd like to vanquish the ghost of 2014, right? I don't know, right? I like the alternate reality we went through last week in terms of Joe probably only really should have 2 titles instead of 4.
Again, kudos to LaMagna on that analysis. That really won me over to the
when he was going through it with me beforehand, I was like, okay, I mean, this is great content. But yeah, we'll see how it plays out. For me, the 6th seed, I think Tate is really gunning for it. He's probably thinking, well, actually, maybe I'm shooting to be the 7 and then I'll win the number 1 seed. That's probably a smarter path. The problem is you have to think of he's already a win ahead. So what is that then? You'd have to lose and have lower points, and it becomes a bunch of complication. You can't predict all of that. So we'll see.
Yeah,
it'll be interesting. I'm really. What's your take on this? Because LaMagna and I differ on this opinion. In the last 2 weeks, his scoring average is, and I don't know if you touched on this when I stepped away, has jumped by 12 points in 2 weeks. is that a mirage or is that a legitimate reflection of newfound team strength? He hasn't really made significant upgrades in that period. What do you attribute that to? Because to me, he's just had two monster performances that take the points forward from like 108 or something to 120, which is a completely different way to look at a team.
So when I look at it, I think you guys have two very different constructions. I think
Yes.
the thing about you is that you have a very, very, very high floor for what your team is going to score every week. Now, yes, you've got some injuries on your squad that's making it really tough, but on the most part, you've got a really high floor. I think Magna's got incredibly explosive players. Look no further than having, Tyreek Hill and Cooper Kupp had
like a 70-yard touchdown.
So I think but again, we can't predict those things.
Yeah.
We know they're going to happen several times a season, especially for those two guys, but you never know what it's going to look like beyond that. Dalvin Cook, for instance, you have a week where he goes out and is good for like 6 fantasy points. Like every now and then those things happen too. So I think there's a lot of variability, and maybe we're just catching Magna coming off of 2 great weeks. And then this week we have scoring where he comes back down to earth a little bit, but these players always have that possibility. So you can't really peg it.
Yeah, I'll say this for you, LaMagna. Matthew Stafford is now in the concussion protocol. Yesterday's post game where they reassess all the players revealed maybe we should put him in the protocol. So I'm sure the NFL is going to have a talk with the Rams, and the new protocol takes a little bit longer to get out of. So that may hurt Kupp this week.
Absolutely.
LaMagna, we know Cooper Kupp is legit. That you don't need to reinforce the point. I think the bigger issue is if Kupp gives you 14 and Hill gives you 13, and neither one is hitting 25, that's the difference from maybe a higher floor, more consistent.
And not so much about individual players as it is the team taken collectively. I do think there's one piece of league business we should talk about before we close. Sure. We haven't really done any weekly recaps or predictions for next week, which we don't always have to do, but you had this as a topic, and I think this is worth discussing, which is this question of what the heck was going on with Bodzen's team last week. How do we address
again, I think slavery in a fantasy context is worth considering. I mean, it's one of those things where obviously with a baby, it's not like Bodzen. Okay, with a baby, I'm not sitting there watching 10 hours of football as much as I'd like to. I'm allowed to watch if we're home. I'm certainly not forbid, but I'll look on my phone. I'll check it, not right away. I'll wait to at least the 1 o'clock window is starting to get closer to the closing. Okay, how am I doing? And I go, what's going on with Bodzen? Bodzen put up 31 points after the 1 o'clock window ended. That was it. Irv Smith, he was a scratch. Bodzen didn't even start 3 positions effectively. I do think there should be some kind of punishment or special place in hell for this type of ineffective ownership. I mean, the reality is he left 12.8 fantasy points on the bench. So let's not say that there was much to do there, but at least he could have started like a flex player.
Well, that was going to be my first point when I noticed this was I went and looked at, okay, well, how would he have done relative to his optimum performance? But the reality is that's not even a good metric because he doesn't have a quarterback who started on his roster.
Right.
And he has no kicker.
But here's the thing. Daniel Jones is on bye. You could have dropped Daniel Jones for a defense. He didn't even roster. Okay, he didn't even roster a defense or a kicker last week. He could have dropped Tyquan Thornton, who scored 1 point for what specifically had 1 catch for 5 yards for a defense or a kicker, right? He could have picked up a starting quarterback. I'll be the first one to say, I think it's perfectly fine on bye weeks to say, I'm not going to play a defense or a kicker or a quarterback. To not play all 3 is a different level of choice and speaks to, look, is his team great? No, but then he dropped Michael Gallup this week. So if you were going to drop Michael Gallup, why not do it when he was on bye? And I mean, so it begs a lot of questions. Bodzen's got, a 1-year-old, so he's got his hands full, but still, I mean, my God, this, I think in the offseason, particularly at the next draft, deserves some special discussion of what type of Waffle House challenge will he have to go through. He lives in, he's a Philly guy, so maybe rotisserie chicken challenge. We'll see, but
listen,
that really,
it definitely didn't change the outcome of that matchup.
Of course not,
for sure, especially with 30 points, I think, coming in from the Pats defense. But tough to see that happen.
Yeah. I mean, yes, Paul. It's Evan Card playbook again. Evan's biggest gripe with the league, which I'm sure we'll hear about with another in-person guest come Thanksgiving week, is that he thinks he's owed a live draft of being able to choose. And my point to him is take it up with Tate's, not my problem. Okay, I don't know how many owners were flying across the pond for a live draft, sir. Multiple owners have small children, or some are getting married next year, or some have new wives, right? People aren't just able to jet set
They're not
for a
all me.
boys' weekend,
Yeah.
for a 72-hour trip to Munich or wherever. So that's an Evan gripe. But yes, it's one thing to have a dominant team and say, I'm not going to play, or just in general, I'm not going to drop my kicker
Right.
or my defense. It's not worth it.
For roster management.
If you want to do that, 3 players, I haven't talked to Bodson about it, but it's an off-season issue that I think, you can't tank in the playoffs or the consolation bracket, but probably in the regular season, there'll need to be some kind of integrity clause to say at least do something. Ishkabilla's challenge. Yes, that'll work as well, Magda. Whatever I'm sure we can come up with something nice and cool for Bodson to do. We'll figure it out.
Yes,
but yes,
got enough brains for that.
100% deserves some kind of stupid challenge as a punishment for what is by far, I think, the lowest points ever, at least
Quite
intentionally.
possible.
I mean, there have been some
Quite
bad
possible.
weeks, but this is new. So yeah, look, it's been a pleasure as always. Here we are, about to wrap up. So parting thoughts.
I'm excited to see what happens for Tate's team. We've
Me
had
too.
2 trades come off.
Me too.
What's this going to do? Is there a third one in the works we don't know
I
about?
hope so.
It's introducing some nice drama to the week.
Again, because I think it's a quiet trade deadline. I want one of these 5 teams from 4 to 5 and 3 to 6 to make a move. Somebody to say, you know what, I'm going to push my chips to the middle of the table. I think there's a chance, whether it's for the 1 seed or just to be in the playoffs or whatever. I want to see it. I'd like to see that, because I think at the top of the league, people are kind of looking around going, okay, I just gotta, hopefully I'm not the one who gets the injuries or gets the big, boom.
You already had
performance.
some injuries, so I think
I've had.
I think
you look at my
acceptable.
roster.
Yeah.
I am like, I got suspensions. I got injuries. I'm ready to get to like week 11, 12, where these players should be back. So, but I'm excited to see, is Tate's done, or is someone else say, let me make a move.
Right.
Don't think there will be, but I'm excited for that as well. So tune in next week. We'll see. We won't have Steve Kornacki back, so you have to find out go on the internet, find out who wins all